I thought my husband had gone to town that last morning to pay the note on our farm. 11 days after we buried him, a man in a gray coat stood on my porch and handed me a printed notice that said the place would be sold on the courthouse steps the first Monday in March for $1,840. I had never in my life heard mentioned. He would not look at me while I read it. He looked at the porch boards and at his own hat and at the road he had come in on, and in that moment I understood that every soul in Pardee County had known for 2 years what I was only finding out that morning. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. Now settle in. But let me start at the beginning, because it did not begin that way at all.
It began on a Tuesday in October of 1933, 4 months before any of it, with the smell of lye soap in my kitchen and bread rising under a flour-sack cloth by the stove. October is the kindest month we get out here. The heat is gone out of the days, but not out of the ground yet, so the mornings come up soft, and the light lies down flat and gold across the stubble where the wheat used to stand. I had the back door propped open with the flat iron. I remember that because Hollis came through it and kicked the iron aside without meaning to, and the door swung shut behind him and made the room dark, and I said something to him about it, and he laughed and propped it open again. That is the last ordinary thing I can put my hand on. Everything after has a mark on it. My name is Verna Ackerly.
In the fall of 1933, I was 38 years old, and I had been married to Hollis Ackerly for 19 years. And if you had asked me that morning whether I knew my husband, I would have laughed at you for asking. We had 160 acres 4 miles south of Ash Grove, Nebraska, most of it in wheat when there was rain and in dust when there wasn't, and a house his father built in 1891 with lumber hauled up from the rail yard by mule. We had 2 children living. Amos was 14 that fall, already taller than me and built like his father through the shoulders, and Bertie was 11 and could not sit still through a meal to save her life. We had buried one between them, a boy who came too early in 1921 and did not stay the night. And there is a stone for him in the churchyard at Ash Grove, with nothing on it but the year, because we could not agree on a name, and then it was too late to matter. That morning Hollis came in from the barn with a cold on his coat and stood in the doorway, working his hands the way he did when they'd stiffened up. He was 44. He had a way of filling a room that had nothing to do with his size. He was not a big man, only wide to the chest and forearms from 25 years of the same work. But when he came into a room, you knew it, and when he left it, the room got smaller. He hung his hat on the 3rd nail by the door. That nail. 19 years, the same nail, and I could tell you what mood he was in by how hard the hat hit it. "This coffee," I said. "I smelled it from the yard." He crossed to the stove and stood with his back to me, pouring, and then he did a thing he had never done. He turned around with the cup in his hand and did not drink from it, and said, "Verna, where do you keep the box?" I was cutting the dough for the second loaf. I did not even look up. "Same place it's been since your mother died. Under the floor of the front room, under the rug, in the same hole your father cut for it. Why?" "No reason." He drank then, and made a face at the heat of it. "Just thinking a man ought to know where his own papers are." "A man ought to know a good many things," I said, and I meant it lightly. I meant it the way a wife means a thing after 19 years, when the words are half worn smooth from use. He laughed, and the subject went out of the room with him, and I did not think about it again for 4 months. I have thought about it every day since. The box was a tin document box, about the length of my forearm, japanned black once and worn down to bare metal at the corners, with a hasp that had never had a lock in it. Hollis's father brought it out from Ohio in a wagon in 1889, and everything the Ackerlys had ever been able to prove about themselves was inside it. The deed to the home place, the certificate of title, birth records for Hollis and his brother Orrin, copied out by hand from the church register because the county courthouse burned in '94 and took the originals with it. The marriage license, with my maiden name on it, in a clerk's hand so fine it looked printed. Hollis's mother's funeral card, and the mortgage papers, and folded inside the mortgage papers, the thing that mattered most to me in the world after my children. The release, paid in full, dated the 14th of June, 1929, stamped by the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Ashgrove, and signed by Clay Dunmore, who was the president of it, and had been since before I was married. You have to understand what that piece of paper was in our house. Hollis's father borrowed against that land in 1911 and died still owing on it. Hollis took the debt with the dirt, the way a man does, and he carried it 18 years. 18 years of wheat, of drought, of the price of wheat going down while the interest stayed where it was. And in June of 1929, he drove into Ashgrove with a canvas sack on the seat beside him, and came home at dusk with that release folded in his shirt pocket. And he did not say a word about it. He set it on the kitchen table in front of me, and put his finger on the date, and then he went out and stood in the yard, with his back to the house, for a long while. And when he came in, his eyes were red, and he said the wind had got at them. We had a supper that night we could not afford, and afterward he took the lamp down off the shelf and lit it, though it was not full dark, and he sat with the box open in his lap and read through everything in it, one paper at a time, slow. That is the picture of my husband I keep. A man in a kitchen chair, with a lamp lit against the sky that was still blue, holding a piece of paper that said the ground under him was his. 4 months later, the crash came, and it did not matter what anybody in Pardee County owned. But by then the paper was in the box, and the box was under the floor, and I never once, in the years after, gave it a thought. It was done. That was the whole point of it. It was done. Now I have to tell you a thing about my husband that I did not tell another living soul for 19 years. And it cost me something to say it out loud, even after he was in the ground. Hollis Ackerly could not read. Not could not read well, could not read. He knew his letters, the way a man knows the names of tools he has seen but never used. He could sign his name. He had practiced that until it was a good signature, better than mine, a big looping H and a hard A. And he could read a number if it was printed clean and standing alone, a price on a feed sack, a figure at the bottom of a bill. Past that, nothing. His mother took sick the winter he was 7, and he was the one they kept home to work. And his brother, Orrin, 2 years younger, was the one they sent on to school. And that was the whole of it. 1 winter, that is all it takes. I found out 3 months into our marriage. I had written him a note and left it on the table when I went to my mother's. And I came back to find him sitting in front of it with his hands flat on the wood on either side. And the look on his face when he raised his head is a thing I would give a good deal to unsee. I never wrote him another note. I read the paper to him at night and made it seem like company, I read the mail out loud and made it seem like gossip. When the seed catalog came, I read the descriptions and he made the choices. And any man watching would have said Hollis Ackerly was picking his own seed. And he was. He was. I want that understood. He was not a foolish man. He could look at a sky and tell you what Thursday would bring. He could put his hand flat on a cow's side and tell you within a week when she'd calve. He could not read the words that told the world what was his. And there was one other person alive who knew it, and that was his brother. Orrin Ackerly farmed the quarter section that adjoined ours on the north, land their father had split between them, and Orrin's half was the poorer half, and both of them knew it. He was a narrow man, narrow through the shoulders and narrow in the face, and he had a way of standing too close when he talked to you. He had been to school through the 8th grade, and he had a fine, clear hand, and for 19 years, whenever there was a paper to be signed, it was Orrin who read it aloud to his brother, and Orrin who filled in the figures, and Orrin who said, "Sign here, Holly, right here on this line." I let it happen. That is the part I will answer for. I could have sat at that table myself. I could have said, "I read it. He's my husband." But a woman's reading her husband's business in front of his brother says a thing about that husband. And I knew what it said. And I loved him. And so for 19 years I stood at the stove with my back to the table and let his brother be his eyes. That October Tuesday, after Hollis asked me where the box was, we had a good month. I want to be careful and honest here, because looking back, it is easy to make everything a warning. Most of it was not. Most of it was just our life. We got 2 inches of rain the last week of October, which was more than we'd had in 2 years, and Hollis walked out into it without a coat and stood in the field with his hat off like a fool. And Amos ran out after him, and I stood in the door and watched my husband and my son standing in the rain in a dead field, and I was as happy as I have ever been. But there were things. There were 3 things, and I am going to set them down in order, because each one of them I explained away, and each one of them was the truth trying to get in the door. The first was the letters. Twice that fall the mail came with an envelope in it from the Farmers and Merchants Bank, and both times Hollis took it off the table and put it in his coat before I had my hands dry. The first time I said, "What's the bank want?" And he said, "Seed money for spring. They send out about it every year." And that was true, they did. The second time, I did not ask. I've gone back over that second time more than anything else. I was at the sink. I heard the envelope go into his coat. I heard him go out. And I stood there with my hands in the water, and I thought, plain as speaking, he does not want me to see that. And then I thought, well, a man's got a right. And I finished the dishes. The second thing was Orrin. He came around more that fall than he had in years. Orrin never came without a reason. A tool to borrow, a hand to ask for. But that October and November, he came 4 times with no reason at all, and he sat in my kitchen and drank my coffee and asked after the children and looked around the room while he talked. That is the thing I keep coming back to. He looked around the room, not at me, at the room, at the walls, at the front room doorway, the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of making an offer on. The third thing was said by Hollis himself, in November, in the barn, and I have turned it over so many times the edges have worn off it. I had gone out with a lantern to tell him supper was ready. He was standing at the workbench doing nothing at all, just standing, with both hands on the wood. And he said, without turning around, "Verna, if a man did a thing to protect somebody, and it turned out to be the worst thing he could have done, is he to blame for it, or is he not?" I set the lantern on the bench That depends on what he did. Say he didn't do anything. Say he just didn't say anything. Same question, I said. Depends what he didn't say. He was quiet a while. Then he laughed, short, and picked up a wrench he had no use for and said, "You're a hard woman, Verna Ackerly." "I'm a tired woman. Supper's on." And he came in and ate his supper and complimented the beans and helped Birdie with a knot in her shoe. And that was the last time my husband ever tried to tell me. I want you to hear that clearly, because it took me a long time to arrive at it, and it changed everything about how I remember him. He was not hiding it from me that night. He was trying to hand it to me.
He got as close as a man like him could get, and I said something clever about it, and he laughed and put it back down. He died on the 16th of January, 1934, in the Northfield, about 11 in the morning. Amos was with him. They were pulling posts out of frozen ground for a fence line that did not need moving, which was a thing Hollis did in winter to have something to do. And Amos said his father sat down on the wagon tongue and said he'd got dizzy and asked for a minute, and then said, "Tell your mother." And that was all. 14 years old. He carried his father 200 yards to the wagon by himself, because he could not think what else to do, and he will not talk about it to this day. The doctor came out from Ashgrove and said it was the heart, and had likely been coming a while. He asked if Hollis had complained of anything. I said no.
And Amos, standing in the doorway with his father's blood dried on his coat where he'd carried him. It was from the hand. He'd torn it on the wire. It was nothing. Amos said, "He had that pain in his arm since harvest, Ma." And that was the first I heard of it. We buried him on the 19th in the churchyard at Ashgrove, next to the stone with just the year on it. Half the county came. Orrin stood at my right hand at the graveside and put his palm flat between my shoulder blades and left it there. And I remember thinking that it was kind of him, and also that I wanted it off me. Clay Dunmore came from the bank in a good black coat and shook my hand at the fence line and said, "Hollis Ackerly was as honest a man as ever farmed in Pardee County." And he was. Understand that everything that comes after, everything I am going to tell you, does not touch that. He was honest.
He was only ashamed, and ashamed and honest are two different animals, and one of them will eat the other if you leave them in the same pen long enough. The 11 days after the funeral are mostly gone from me. I know we ate because Opal Renfrew from the next place over came every day with something in a cloth and stood over me until I ate it. I know Amos did the chores without being told, morning and night, and that he did his father's share and his own, and would not be talked out of it. I know Birdie stopped talking almost entirely and slept in my bed, and that I let her, and that some nights I was glad of it. And on the 11th day, which was the 30th of January, a Tuesday, a man in a gray coat drove into my yard in a county car and got out with a leather folder under his arm. I met him on the porch. I did not ask him in. There was still a dish of Opal's stewed chicken on the table under a cloth, and I did not want a stranger to see it.
"Mrs. Ackerly," he said, "I'm sorry to trouble you at such a time." He had the decency to look like he meant it. He took a printed sheet out of the folder and held it out and did not let go of it right away, so that for a second we were both holding it. "This is a notice of sale. I am required to hand it to you personally and to tell you what it says."
"I can read."
"Yes, ma'am." He let go. The property described will be sold at public auction on the courthouse steps in Ashgrove on the first Monday of March at 10 o'clock in the morning, in satisfaction of a debt of $1,840.16, secured by a note dated the 9th of April, 1931. The porch board under my left foot has a knot in it shaped like a hand. I looked at it while he talked. I am told my face never changed. Opal says she watched from her yard and thought he'd come about astray. There is no debt, I said. That place was paid off in June of 1929. I have the release in the house. I can put my hand on it in 1 minute.
Ma'am, he was already looking at his hat. The 1929 mortgage was satisfied. That's a matter of record. This is a different note. This is a new debt, taken out against the property in April of 31.
By who? And he looked up then, and he looked at me, and I have never in my life wanted so badly for a man to be lying to me.
It's signed by your husband, he said, and by you.
I do not remember the car leaving. The next thing I have is the front room, and the rug rolled back, and my hands on the floorboards. There were 3 boards that came up together, where Hollis's father had cut them, and you had to lift the middle one first, and at an angle, or it bound. I had watched Hollis do it maybe 6 times in 19 years. My hands knew it anyway. They shook so hard I could not get purchase on the seam, and I had to go to the kitchen and get a table knife and come back. And I remember thinking quite calmly that I ought to slow down, because if I broke the board, I would have to explain it to somebody. The board came up. The cavity underneath smelled the way it always had, like cold dirt and old newspaper. The box was there. I want to say that plainly, because in the seconds it took me to lift that board, I had already buried the box, already decided it was gone, already begun the argument I would have with the sheriff about it. But it was there, black tin, worn to silver at the corners, exactly where it had sat since 1889. I did not open it in the front room. I have wondered why. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table and lit the lamp, though it was 2 in the afternoon and the window was full of white winter light. I lit the lamp, I suppose because that was how it was done in this house. You do not open that box in the ordinary light of a Tuesday. You light the lamp. The hasp turned. The lid came back on the hinge with the small complaint it had always made. Everything was there. That is the thing I was not prepared for. Nothing was missing. The deed, the certificate of title, Hollis's birth record in the pastor's hand, and Orrin's underneath it, the marriage license, the clerk's beautiful writing, my maiden name, his mother's funeral card with the lily on it, the abstract of title in its brown wrapper tied with string, and the mortgage papers from 1911 folded in thirds. I opened them out flat on the table, and my hands were steady now, and I turned the pages one at a time and found nothing, and turned them again and shook them, and turned the box over and put everything out on the table in a heap and went through it, a paper at a time, twice, and then a third time, slowly, saying each one out loud as I set it aside, the way you do when you have already stopped believing in the thing you are looking for. The release was not in the box. I sat down. I want to tell you what that was like in my body, because it was not what I would have guessed. There was no dizziness. There was a cold that started behind my breastbone and went out along my arms to the fingers, and my mouth filled with the taste of a penny. And I was aware of the clock on the shelf being very loud, and of the fact that I had not thought about Hollis for 11 minutes. And that was the first time in 11 days. And then I saw the corner of a paper I did not know sticking out from under the funeral card where I had set it down. It was a single sheet, printed, with the blanks filled in by hand. Farmers and Merchants Bank of Ashgrove, promissory note, 9th of April, 1931, $1,200 at 8%, secured by the property described in the schedule attached. I did not read the rest of the printing. My eyes went where yours would have gone, to the bottom, to the 2 lines. The first line said Hollis Ackerly, in that big looping H, the hard A, the signature he had practiced against his own shame until it was the finest thing about his handwriting. 19 years I had watched that name go on to paper. It was his. There was no question in me about it, not then and not now. He signed that note. The second line said Verna M. Ackerly. And it was not my hand.
I sat with the lamp burning at 2 in the afternoon and looked at my own name, written by somebody else. And here is the strange part, the part I have never been able to make anybody understand. It was good. It was a good forgery. Whoever made it had seen my signature and studied it. The V was right, that little hook I put on the front of it. The way I run the 2 words together at the end, so the Y of Verna nearly touches the A. All of that was right. What was wrong was the M. I do not use a middle initial. I never have. My middle name is Mabel, after my grandmother, and I have hated it since I was 9 years old, and I have signed my name Verna Ackerly on every document I have put my hand to since the day I was married. Any person who had ever actually watched me sign anything would have known that. Any person who had only ever seen my name written out by somebody else, on a church roll, on a school card, on the flyleaf of a family Bible, would have thought the M belonged there. I put my head down on my arms on the kitchen table, next to my husband's true name and my own false one, and I did not cry. I have thought about that too. I did not cry for another 19 days. And when it came about something else entirely. Now, I could tell you that I went straight to town. That is not what happened, and I have promised to tell this honestly. What happened is that I spent that night and the whole of the next day building an explanation. I am not a stupid woman. But there is a thing that happens when the ground goes out from under you, where the mind will run in any direction at all, rather than the true one. And mine ran hard. I decided that Hollis had borrowed $1,200 in April of 1931, and that he had done it for a reason, and that the reason was good. 1931 was the year we lost the whole crop, and the year Bertie had the fever that took the hearing in her left ear for 4 months. $1,200 would have been the doctor and the hospital in Omaha, and the seed, and the taxes. I decided he had signed my name himself, or had somebody do it, because I was in Omaha with Bertie those weeks, and there was nobody to ask. I decided the interest had run it up to $1,800, and that he had meant to tell me, and had not known how. I built the whole thing. It took me a night and a day, and by the end of it, I nearly had it standing on its own legs. And then on Thursday morning, I went to the wire in the pantry where I keep the year's receipts, because I have kept every receipt that ever came into this house since I was a bride. And I took down April of 1931 and read every one of them. There was no doctor's bill. There was no seed bill. The taxes had been paid in February, and on the 11th of April, 1931, 2 days after that note was signed, Hollis had spent $1.40 at Teague's store in Ashgrove on a hinge, a can of paint, and a pound of coffee. A man does not borrow $1,200 on Thursday and buy a hinge on Saturday. Not that man.
not my husband. That is when I got the wagon out. The Farmers and Merchants Bank of Ashgrove stood on the corner of Main and 3rd, red brick with stone steps that had a hollow worn into the middle of the top one. I had been up those steps perhaps a dozen times in my life. Hollis did the banking. Every farm wife in that county could have told you the same thing. The men did the banking. Clay Dunmore came out from behind the counter himself when he saw me, both hands out, wearing the same black coat he had worn at the graveside. He was 60 that year, a heavy man, gone soft, white hair combed back wet, a gold watch chain across the front of him. He had the kind of manner that had made him president of that bank at 34 and kept him there 26 years. He took my elbow and steered me back to his office and shut the door and sat me down and asked after the children before I could get a word out.
"They're well," I said.
"Mr. Dunmore, a man came out to my place on Tuesday." "I know it." He sat down heavily behind the desk and drew his hand down his face. "Verna, I have not slept since Monday. I want you to know I fought this. I asked the board to hold it over till spring. I said, that woman has just buried her husband. And they said to me, Clay, we are holding paper on 400 farms in this county, and if we hold off for a widow, we will be holding off for every man with a story." He shook his head slowly. "I lost. I wanted you to hear that from me, and not from talk in town. There is no debt on my place. Verna, it was paid in June of 29. I saw the release. I held it in my own hands. It was in the box. Now I am going to describe something exactly, because at the time it meant nothing to me, and afterward it meant everything. Clay Dunmore did not say what a man says. A man says, what release? A man says, are you certain? A man says, let me send for the ledger. What Clay Dunmore did was lean back in his chair and let a long breath out through his nose and say, in a voice full of sorrow, "It's gone missing then." I did not hear it. God help me, I sat there and did not hear it. He had not asked me one question, and he already knew that a particular piece of paper was missing from a tin box under a floor 4 miles south of town. The 1929 mortgage was released, he went on. That is a matter of record. Nobody disputes it, and I will say so to any man who asks me. But on the 9th of April, 1931, your husband came into this bank and executed a new note against that property. I witnessed it myself. It has not been serviced in 2 years. I am sorry, Verna. That is the fact of it. Show me. He got the file. He laid the note on the desk and turned it around to face me and put one finger down at the bottom of it, on the 2 names, and left the finger there while he talked. And I looked again at my name in another person's hand, with the M standing in it like a stranger at a family table. And I said, that is not my signature. The room went very quiet. Out in the lobby, somebody was counting coin into a drawer. Mrs. Ackerly. He had stopped calling me Verna. I want you to think carefully about what you are saying to me. I did not sign it. I have never once in my life signed my name with an M in it. Look at anything I have ever put my hand to. Look at my marriage license. I don't use it. Your husband carried that note out to the farm and brought it back signed. That is the ordinary way of it, and it is done that way 50 times a year in this county. He tapped the paper twice, gently, the way you would pat a dog. Now, if what you are telling me is that Hollis Ackerly forged his own wife's name on a bank instrument, Verna, think what that does to that man. He is 11 days in the ground, and he cannot answer it. And there it was. He did it so smoothly that I did not feel the door shut. If I said the signature was false, I was calling my dead husband a forger in the office of the man who had shaken my hand at his grave. If I said nothing, I lost the farm. I sat still for a moment. Then I said, "Who else was in the room?" "I beg your pardon?" "On the 9th of April, 31, when my husband signed this, who else was in the room?" Clay Dunmore looked at me a moment longer than he needed to. "Just Hollis and myself," he said, "as I recall." I drove the 4 miles home with the reins loose and let the horse take me. Somewhere on that road, between the section corner and my own gate, something turned over in me. Not a thought, exactly. It came into the body first, the way these things do. A stillness that came down over the top of the panic and pressed it flat. Hollis could not read. Hollis Ackerly could not read one word of that note. Not the amount, not the rate, not the schedule of property attached to it. He could read a figure standing alone on a page, and he could write his name, which meant that somebody had sat down with my husband on the 9th of April, 1931, and read that paper to him out loud, and told him what it said. And there were exactly 2 people on this earth who had ever done that job for him. One of them was me, and I had been in Omaha. I did not go to Orrin. I want to be clear about the order of things, because the order is the whole of it. I went home and I made supper, and I put the children to bed, and then I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and did a thing I had not done in 11 days, which was think about my husband instead of about my situation. I thought about the barn in November. Say a man did a thing to protect somebody, and it turned out to be the worst thing he could have done. I thought about the 2 envelopes from the bank that went into his coat before my hands were dry. I thought about Orrin sitting in my kitchen 4 times that fall, with no reason at all, looking at my walls. And I thought about a thing that had happened in the spring of 1931 that I had put away so completely I had to go and dig it out. When I came back from Omaha with Bertie, she was 7 and thin as a rail and deaf on the left side, and I had been gone 19 days. Hollis met the train at Ash Grove, and on the ride home he asked me, out of nothing, whether I thought a man's word was worth more than a paper or less. I said it depended on the man. He said, "That's what I told him." I said, "Told who?" And he said, "Nobody. Nothing. Look at that sky." I sat in that kitchen until the lamp began to smoke, and then I trimmed the wick and sat some more. And around 1 in the morning I said out loud to nobody, "You knew." And the house did not answer me, and I went to bed and I did not sleep. In the morning I did 3 things. I've gone over them many times, and I do not think I would change any of them, though God knows they cost. First, I went out to the barn while Amos was milking, and I told my son that the place was to be sold on the first Monday in March. He was 14. He had his forehead against the cow's flank, and he did not stop milking, and he did not look up, and after a while he said, "Pa wouldn't have let that happen." And I said, "No, he wouldn't." Which was true in a way I did not yet understand, and false in a way I did not yet understand either. And both of those things were sitting in the same sentence. Second, I took the tin box out of the house. I put it in a flour sack and carried it a 1/4 mile out to the old sod cellar on the north line, the one Hollis's father dug and nobody had used in 30 years.
and I put it inside a milk can and put the lid on the can and put a board over the top. Somebody had already taken one piece of paper out of that box while my husband lay in the front room with the neighbors coming and going. I had thought about that for 2 days. Whoever it was had known where the board was, and known which board, and known that the house would be full of people and nobody would look twice.
Third, I hitched the wagon and drove into Ashgrove and went to see the one man in Pardee County who had every reason on God's earth to shut the door in my face. Ransom Teague kept the store at the north end of Main Street, and had kept it since before the war, and the sign over the door still said Teague and Son, although the son had gone to Denver in 1920 and had not been back. Here is what was between us. In the fall of 1922, the cooperative elevator at Ashgrove failed. 41 farmers had wheat in it, and there was money owing all over the county, and there was a committee of 3 men who had signed for the elevator's paper, and Ransom Teague was one of them, and Hollis Ackerly's father was another, and the third had died in the influenza. When it went down, Teague paid. He sold 80 acres of good bottomland his father had homesteaded, and he paid what the committee owed, and he never said one public word about who else had signed. The Ackerlys kept their 160. Teague kept a store and no land. And for the rest of his life, people in that town said, in the way people say a thing without ever quite saying it, that Ransom Teague had been careless with the elevator. Hollis never spoke of it. Not once in 19 years. And I had understood, in the vague way a woman understands the thing her husband will not discuss, that there was something owed there, and that the owing was old, and that it would not be paid in my lifetime. The bell over the door rang. Teague was behind the counter with a pencil behind his ear, 70 years old, a tall, dry man with a face like a boot. There were 2 women looking at yard goods by the window. When he saw me, he set the pencil down. "Mrs. Ackerly." "Mr. Teague, I need to talk to you, and I'd rather it wasn't in front of anybody." He looked at me for about 3 seconds. Then he called back through the curtain to his wife to mind the front, and lifted the counter flap and took me into the back room where the stock was, and set a crate on end for me to sit on, and did not sit down himself. "They're selling your place," he said. "How do you know that?" "It was posted at the courthouse Tuesday noon, and it was in the Sentinel yesterday. And there's nothing else being talked about in this town." He folded his arms. "I'm sorry. Your husband was a decent man." "Mr. Teague, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask that I understand what I'm asking and who I'm asking it of." "Then ask it." "Did you ever hold a paper for my husband?" He did not answer right away. He turned and looked out the little window at the alley, and something moved in his face. "Why do you ask me that?" "Because everything else in that box was where it should be," I said, "and one thing was not. And my husband asked me in October where I kept the box. And he has never asked me such a thing in 19 years. And because a man who is afraid of what's in his own house will sometimes put a thing where nobody would look for it. And there is nobody in Pardee County who would look for an Ackerly paper in Ransom Teague's store." Ransom Teague was quiet a long time. Then he said, 1931, June, I think. He come in on a Saturday, and he waited till the store was empty, which for Hollis was a piece of work, because that man could not be still. And he had an envelope, and he said, "Rance, will you keep this for me?" And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "It's the paper says my place is mine." And I said, "Why in the world are you not keeping that in your own house?" And he said, he stopped. "Please," I said. He said, "Because my brother knows every board in my house." Teague's jaw worked. "I put it in the safe. It has been in that safe 2 years and 8 months. and I have never once opened the envelope, because it was not mine to open, and because I did not want to know. I sat on that crate in the back of a general store and heard the two women out front laughing about something, and I could not get any air. "I'd like it," I said. "It's yours." He went and got it. It was an ordinary envelope, the kind the bank hands out, and on the front of it in pencil somebody had written ACK in block capitals. And I knew Hollis had written that himself, and it had probably taken him a minute and a half. I opened it there with him standing over me. The release. Farmers and Merchants Bank of Ashgrove, 14th of June, 1929. Paid in full, the mortgage of record dated the 2nd of March, 1911, satisfied and discharged, and the property released from the lien thereof. Stamped. And signed at the bottom in a firm, round hand, Clay Dunmore, President. I read it 4 times, then I said, "This doesn't help me." Teague blinked. "Ma'am, that is your release." "It's a release of the 1911 mortgage. Dunmore says so himself, out loud. He says the 29 mortgage was satisfied and it's a matter of record. They're not selling my place on the old debt. They're selling it on a new note from April of 31 that I never signed and my husband could not read." I folded it back into the envelope carefully because my hands wanted to crush it. "This proves we were free and clear in 29. Nobody argues that. The whole question is what happened in 31. Ransom Teague looked at me with an expression I could not read at all. Then he said, "Mrs. Ackerly, do you know what your husband said to me when he handed me that envelope?" "No." "He said, 'If anything ever comes of this, don't you take it to Verna. Take it to a lawyer first.'" The room was very still. "Now why," said Teague slowly, "would a man say a thing like that about a paper that only proves he paid his debt?" We stood there and looked at each other while it came up out of the floor at both of us at the same time. "There's something else in the safe," I said. "No." He shook his head. "That's the only thing he ever give me." "Then why?" And Ransom Teague, 70 years old, went white around the mouth and said, "Because he didn't mean the paper. He meant if anything ever comes of it. He knew, Mrs. Ackerly. Whatever it is, he knew about it in June of 31. 2 months after they say he signed that note." I got home at dusk. Amos had the chores done, and Bertie had set the table wrong the way she always did, forks on the right, and I did not correct her. I sat down and ate and answered when I was spoken to. And then when they were in bed, I put my coat back on and walked a 1/4 mile up the north line in the dark to the sod cellar with a lantern. And I got the milk can out from under the board, and I brought the box back to the house and set it on the kitchen table. And I did what I should have done on the first day. I read every single thing in it. Out loud. Slowly. All of it, front and back, including the parts nobody reads. And on the back of the abstract of title, in the brown wrapper, tied with string, on the last page where the chain of title is written out, every transfer of that 160 acres since the government patent in 1882, in a clerk's small, careful hand. There was an entry at the bottom, in a different ink. It was dated the 2nd of May, 1931, 3 weeks after the note. It read, Assignment of interest, H. Ackerly to O. Ackerly, 1/2 undivided. Recorded, Book 41, page 218. I want to explain what that meant, because it took me most of that night, and a great deal of help afterward to understand it. And if I had understood it that evening, I might have done something foolish. 3 weeks after somebody read my husband a paper he could not read, and had him sign it, my husband signed another paper. And that second paper gave his brother Orrin an undivided half interest in the home place. Not the whole, half. Which meant that when the bank sold that farm on the courthouse steps to satisfy a note of $1,840, the man who owned half the equity in it, the man who would have first claim on anything above the debt, the man who could bid on it with his own half already in his pocket and only need to raise the other, was Verna Ackerly. And there was one more thing, and this is the thing that put me on my feet. The assignment was signed by Hollis, and underneath his name was a line for a witness, and the witness had signed it, C. Dunmore. I sat back in the chair. The lamp had burned down, and I had not noticed. Out in the dark somewhere, a coyote went off, and then 2 more, the way they do. Clay Dunmore had sat in his office 3 days before and told me to my face, with his finger on the paper, that on the 9th of April there had been just Hollis and himself in that room. And 3 weeks after that, he had put his own name as witness to a document handing half my farm to my husband's brother, and had not thought to mention it while he was telling me how sorry he was and how he had fought the board. I did not sleep at all that night, and I did not need to. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, the fear went out of me. I have tried many times to describe what came in behind it, and the closest I can get is this. It was like a house going quiet after a long wind. I was not afraid anymore, and I was not sad, and my hands had stopped shaking, and I sat at my own kitchen table and thought clearly for the first time since the 30th of January. I had 19 days. In the morning, I woke Amos before light and told him he would be doing his own chores and mine both for a while. And he said, all right, and asked no questions. And I have never in my life been prouder of anybody. Then I hitched up and drove 22 miles north to Kearney, because I was not going to a lawyer in Ashgrove, where every man in a suit had Clay Dunmore's name on a note somewhere. I had $11 in the coffee tin, and I took 9 of it. The lawyer's name was Wendell Frick. He was young, which I did not like at first, and he had a cheap office over a hardware store, which I liked better. He listened to the whole of it without saying one word, for 40 minutes. And then he asked me 4 questions. Do you have the release? Yes. Do you have the note? No. The bank has it. I saw it. Can you prove your husband could not read? And that was the one that stopped me. I sat there in a lawyer's office 22 miles from home and understood, all at once, what 19 years of protecting a man had cost me. There was nothing. There was no school record because he had never gone. There was no letter he had failed to write because I had written them all. There was not one living soul who could stand up and say, I saw Hollis Ackerly try to read and fail, because I had spent my whole marriage making certain no such person existed. I had done it so well that his shame had outlived him and turned into a weapon in another man's hand. That is when I cried. 19 days after he died, in a stranger's office over a hardware store in Kearney, Nebraska, and Wendell Frick had the good sense to look out the window until I was through. 4th question, he said when I had done. Who benefits? His brother, Orrin. He's got half by the assignment, and the bank sells the whole thing for $1,800. and he can buy it in for the debt because he already owns half the equity. And he ends up with the whole 160 for less than the price of a good team. And why now? Why not in 31, when he had it all set up? I don't know. Find that out, said Wendell Frick, and you will have the case. A man does not sit on a scheme for 3 years for the fun of it, Mrs. Ackerly. Something was stopping him, and then it stopped. I said, my husband was stopping him. Then your husband knew? Yes, I said. My husband knew. And there it was, out in the room, in words, for the first time. Wendell Frick charged me $4 and told me to come back in a week with 3 things. Proof of what Orrin had been doing with money since 1931, anything at all in writing that showed my husband had known about the note, and 1 witness, any witness, who could speak to Hollis and his letters. I drove home in the dark and got in at 9:30, and Opal Renfrew was sitting in my kitchen with my children, and she had fed them and washed up, and she took 1 look at my face and put the kettle back on. Opal Renfrew was 62 and had farmed the next place over with her husband until he died in 28 and had farmed it alone since. She was a small woman with a voice like a hinge. She had known Hollis since he was a boy. Now, she said, setting the cup down in front of me, you've been to a lawyer. How do you, Verna, you drove past my house at 6 in the morning, going north, in your good coat. She sat down across from me. You may as well tell me. I've had 11 days of watching you go around this place like a woman looking for something she can't name. So I told her. All of it. From the man in the gray coat to the entry on the back of the abstract, and it took an hour, and she did not interrupt once. When I finished, she sat back and folded her hands and said 1 word. Orrin. You don't sound surprised. I am not surprised. She turned her cup around on the table. Verna, I am going to tell you something now, and you are going to want to be angry at me for not telling you sooner. And I would like you to save it up and be angry at me later, because we have not got the time tonight. All right. In the spring of 31, sometime in April, I come over here to borrow your sad iron, and there was a wagon in the yard I didn't know. And I come around the side of the house because the kitchen door was standing open, and I heard Verna Ackerly in this room, reading a paper out loud to your husband. The clock ticked 11 times before I could speak. What did it say? Now that's just it. I didn't listen. Why would I? A man reading a paper to his brother. She shook her head slowly. But I have thought about it 100 times since, because of what Hollis said. Orrin got done reading, and Hollis said, and I can hear it now. Hollis said, that's the same as the last one then. And Orrin said, same as the last one, only the dates change. Go on and sign it, Holly. The same as the last one, I said. That's what he said. Opal. My hands had gone cold around the cup. How many were there? That, she said, is what I've been chewing on since Tuesday. The next morning I drove into Ash Grove and walked into the office of the Register of Deeds in the courthouse basement, which is a place I had never been in my life, and I told the clerk I wanted to see Book 41, page 218. She was a young woman with ink on her fingers, and she was not curious about me at all, which was the best thing that happened to me all that month. She brought the book. It was enormous, and it smelled of dust and mildew, and she showed me how the index worked, and then she went back to her desk and left me alone with it for 2 hours. Page 218 was the assignment. 1/2 undivided interest, H. Ackerly to O. Ackerly, 2nd of May, 1931. Witness, C. Dunmore. just as the abstract said. Then I went to the grantor index, which is a list of every person in Pardee County who has ever signed away anything, and I found A, and I found Ackerly, and I put my finger under the line and went down. Ackerly, Hollis. There were 4 entries after 1929. The 2nd of May, 31, the assignment to Orrin. The 14th of September, 31, a second mortgage, $600, to the Farmers and Merchants Bank. The 3rd of March, 32, a chattel mortgage on the machinery and the team, $400, to the Farmers and Merchants Bank. And the 19th of June, 32, a release of that chattel mortgage. Paid. I sat in the basement of the courthouse with my finger on the page and did the arithmetic. $1,200 in April 31, $600 in September, $400 in March of 32, paid off 3 months later. $2,200 borrowed against my farm in 11 months. And I had lived in that house every one of those days and cooked 3 meals a day in it. And I had not known. And then the 4th thing, which I did not expect and which changed the shape of everything. After June of 1932, nothing. 20 months of nothing. Not one instrument, not one line, not one signature. Something stopped in June of 1932.
I went back up the stairs and out onto Main Street and stood in front of the courthouse in the cold, and I had the strangest feeling that my husband was standing about 4 feet behind my left shoulder, and I said to him, in my head, "All right, Hollis, what happened in June of 32? And he did not answer, because he never once in his life gave me a straight answer when a joke would do. But I knew where to go and ask. Ransom Teague kept his store ledgers on a shelf in the back room, 1 book to a year, going back to 1896. I asked him if I could see 1932, and he did not ask me why. He put it on the counter and turned the lamp so I could see and left me to it. Farm accounts in a country store are a diary of a family that the family does not know it is keeping. Everything is there. The month you had money and the month you did not. The week somebody was sick because of the camphor and the lemons. The spring you gave up on a field because you stopped buying seed for it. I found June of 1932, and on the 22nd of June, in Teague's neat hand, there was an entry against the Ackerly account that read, "Cash advanced, $410 per H.A. against fall wheat." I looked at it for a while. Then I called out to the front, "Mr. Teague, did you lend my husband $410 in the summer of 32? He came through the curtain, wiping his hands. "I did. Where would a man in this county have got $410 in the summer of 32? He wouldn't." Teague put both hands on the counter. "Nobody had it. I had it, because I had 11 years of nobody buying anything from me on credit that I hadn't already written off, and because I do not drink, and I do not have children living." He looked at me steadily. "He come in here and asked me for it, and would not say what for. And I want you to understand, Mrs. Ackerly, that I gave it to him inside of 2 minutes, and he knew I would." "Because of the elevator?" "Because of the elevator." "He paid off the chattel mortgage with it," I said. "On the 19th of June, 3 days before he borrowed it from you. He borrowed from you to get the team and the machinery out from under the bank." "That would be the size of it." "And then it stopped." I put my hand flat on the ledger. "For 20 months, nothing else got signed. Mr. Teague, what happened in June of 32? And Ransom Teague said, "You'd better ask his brother." I did not go to Orrin's house. I want to be clear about that, because the way it happened afterward People said I went out there and made a scene, and I did not. I did not have to. Orrin came to me. It was the 9th of February, a Friday, 3 weeks and 2 days before the sale. There had been a skiff of snow in the night. I was in the kitchen boiling clothes when I heard the wagon, and I looked out and saw his hat coming across the yard, and I had time to think one clear thought before he knocked, which was, he does not know that I know anything. That was worth more than anything else I owned. I let him in and gave him coffee. He sat in Hollis's chair. He did that every time, and I do not believe he ever once noticed he was doing it.
Verna. He wrapped both hands around the cup. I've come about the sale. Have you? It's a hard business. He shook his head at the table. It is a hard, hard business, and I have gone round and round with myself about how to say this to you, and there is no good way, so I'm going to say it plain, the way Holly would have. He looked up. I want to buy the place. I did not say anything. That is the thing I learned in those weeks, and I will pass it on to you for nothing. When a man has come to tell you something, do not help him. Now hear me out, Orrin said. That sale is going to happen whether you or I like it or not. And when it happens, one of two things. Either some stranger out of Kearney with cash money takes that $160 for $1,800, and you and them children are on the road by Easter, or it stays in this family. That's all I'm offering. I'm offering to keep Pa's ground in the Ackerly name. And where would I be? Right here. He spread his hands. Right in this house. Verna, I would not put my brother's widow off her own porch. You'd stay on. You'd have the house and the garden as long as you wanted it. And Amos would work the ground with me and learn it right. And when he's of age, we'd see about him having a piece of it. I'd put that in writing. You'd put it in writing, I said. I would. He looked me right in the face when he said it. That is the part I still think about. He had a good face, Orrin. Narrow, but good. He was 52 years old, and he had buried his mother, his father, and his brother. And he had sat in my kitchen at Christmas for 19 years, and he looked me right in the face. How much would you have to raise, I asked, to buy it in? $1,840, and the costs. Call it $1,900. That's a great deal of money for a man farming 80 poor acres. It is, he nodded slowly. I've been to the bank. Clay's been decent about it. There's ways it can be arranged. I imagine there are. I got up and refilled his cup he had not touched. Orrin, can I ask you something? It's been sitting on me. Anything. Did Hollis ever borrow money that you knew of after 29? And I watched my husband's brother go still. It was not much. If you had been standing in the door, you would not have seen it. The hands stopped moving on the cup, that was all. Not that I know of, he said. Only that notice said $1,840, and I've been trying to think where in the world it came from. Verna, his voice dropped into something gentle and terrible. I have not wanted to say this to you, but Holly was. You know how he was. He was a proud man, and he was not a... He did not have a head for paper. And there were years there, 31, 32, when things was hard for everybody, and I think maybe he got in over his head and could not bring himself to tell you. He reached across and put his hand over mine. It don't change what he was. It's just that a man will do a foolish thing to keep from looking foolish in front of his wife. I looked down at his hand on mine. You're right, I said. That's exactly what a man will do. He left about an hour later, and I stood at the window and watched the wagon out to the road. And then I went and was sick in the wash basin,
And then I washed my face and went back to the boiling clothes.
Because he had made one mistake. And I did not think he knew he had made it. And I have never been sure to this day. I had never once, in that entire conversation, told Verna Ackerly the amount of the debt. He had said it before I did. 1840. And the costs. It was printed on the notice, and the notice was posted at the courthouse, and it had been in the Sentinel. Any man in the county could have known it. But he had also sat at my table and pretended to hear for the first time that his brother had died owing money. And a man who is hearing it for the first time asks how much. He never asked. I had 18 days, and I have never used 18 days better. I want to tell this part carefully, because it is the part where I stopped being a woman that things were happening to. It began with Opal Renfrew driving me back to Kearney on the 12th of February, because she said a woman who has been to a lawyer once alone will lose her nerve going the second time. And she was right. And she sat in that office beside me with her handbag on her knees like a church deacon. I laid it out for Wendell Frick in order. The 4 instruments in the grantor index, the 20 months of silence after June of 1932, Teague's ledger and the $410. Opal, who had heard Orrin read a paper aloud to my husband in April of 31, and had heard my husband say, "That's the same as the last one, then." Frick wrote for a long time without speaking. Then he set the pen down. "Mrs. Ackerly, I am going to say a hard thing to you." "Say it." "Everything you have brought me proves your husband was borrowing money and that his brother was reading him the papers. It does not prove one single dishonest act. A man is allowed to borrow. A man is allowed to have his brother read to him. A man is allowed to assign a half-interest to his own kin." He tapped the paper. "The forged signature is the whole case, and the forged signature is worth nothing without 2 things I do not have. 1. Proof that the hand on that note is not yours. 2. Proof that your husband could not read what he was signing. Without those, all I have got is a widow who doesn't like the arrangement." "How do I prove a hand?" "You put your signature and that signature in front of the court, and you make the difference so plain that a jury of farmers can see it from across a room." He shrugged. "The M helps you. It is not enough. Somebody will say a woman signs her name different on a Tuesday than a Sunday. And the reading? That one is worse," he said, "because it is a negative. You cannot prove a man could not do a thing. You can only bring somebody who saw him fail." I sat there and thought about it, and Opal sat beside me and thought about it. And after a while, Opal said to the room in general, "What about the mark?" We both looked at her. "What mark?" I said. "Verna. Their father died in 1911, and there was the estate. And Hollis was 1 and 20, and Orrin was 19. And there was paper to be signed at the courthouse. And I was in that room because my Elmer was on the jury of You for the Road that year." She turned to Frick. "Hollis Ackerly did not sign his father's estate papers. He made his mark, an X, and the clerk wrote out his name beside it. And I stood not 8 feet away." Wendell Frick got very quietly to his feet. "Mrs. Renfrew," he said, "will you say that in front of a judge?" "Young man, I will say it in front of God." We were in the basement of the Pardee County Courthouse by 2 o'clock. The estate of Absalom Ackerly, deceased, 1911, Book 19. And there it was, on the 3rd page, in a clerk's copperplate hand. Hollis Ackerly, and beside the name, a small hard X in a different, heavier ink, and after it the words, "His mark." And beneath that, the clerk's certification that the instrument had been read aloud to the said Hollis Ackerly in his presence. Read aloud to the said Hollis Ackerly. I put my hand on that page in that cold basement, and I said, out loud, "There you are." Frick had the clerk make certified copies of everything, which cost me $2.40, and which was the best money I ever spent. And on the way out, going past the recorder's counter, I stopped and asked the young woman with ink on her fingers one more question. And it was not a clever question. It was only the next one. "When a bank takes a note like this," I said, "does anybody ever come and check the books?" She looked up. "The examiners? Sure. State man comes twice a year." Then she made a small face. "Though this year they say it'll be the federal, on account of the new insurance. Everybody's got to be examined before they can carry the insurance." "When?" "March, I heard." She shrugged and went back to her stamping. "They was in at the farmers and merchants all last week getting ready. Mr. Dunmore's been in a state." I stood at that counter for a moment with my hand on the wood. Then I went out and found Wendell Frick on the courthouse steps and said, "Mr. Frick, what does a bank need 3 weeks before a federal examiner walks in the door?" And he looked at me, and I watched a young man understand something all at once, and his face went the color of paper. "It needs its bad paper to turn into good land," he said. "Here is the shape of the thing, as we put it together over the next 6 days, and as it came out afterward in the district court at Kearney, and as I've carried it since." Clay Dunmore had lost money that was not his, not in a wicked way, in the ordinary way, which is worse, because a wicked man knows what he is. He had taken deposits and put them into stock on margin in 1928 and 1929, like half the country bankers in the state of Nebraska, and when it went, it went. He had a hole in the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Ashgrove of somewhere near $26,000, and he had spent 5 years papering it over. The way you paper it over is with notes. A note is an asset. If a bank is short of money, but it holds notes secured by good land, the books balance and everybody goes home. And in 1931, in Pardee County, Nebraska, there was almost no such thing as good land free and clear, because every farm in that county was already mortgaged to the roof. Except a few. Except the ones that had been paid off in the last good year. Except on the 14th of June, 1929, 160 acres, 4 miles south of Ashgrove. He needed the paper more than he needed the money. That is the thing that took me longest to understand, and the thing that made me the angriest for the longest time. Nobody ever wanted $1,840 from me. They wanted a piece of paper in a drawer that said the bank was owed $1,840 by somebody good for it, and they wanted it to be real enough to survive a man in a gray suit turning the pages. And to get that, he needed one farmer who would sign what he was told to sign, and one relative to do the telling. Orrin's price was half. They took $1,200 in April of 31 and $600 in September, and Hollis never saw a dollar of it. And in March of 32, they came back for $400 more against the team and the machinery, and that is the one that broke it. Because a man does not notice the ground being taken out from under him, but he notices when they come for his horses. In June of 1932, Hollis walked into Ransom Teague's store and asked for $410 and would not say what for. He paid off the chattel mortgage with it and got his team back out of the bank's hands. And then he went to his brother. I do not know what was said. Nobody does. But whatever it was, it stopped everything for 20 months. And I know two things about it for certain. The first is that Hollis did not go to the sheriff and did not go to a lawyer and did not tell his wife.
The second is what Orrin said to him. And I know that because Orrin himself said it out loud in a room full of people on the 5th of March, 1934. And I will come to that. But you have already worked it out, most of you. Because what could Hollis Ackerly have done? Go to the county attorney and say, "My brother read me a paper and lied about what was in it"? Very well, Mr. Ackerly. Why did you not read it yourself? And there is the trap, and it had no floor in it. To accuse his brother, he had to stand up in the town where he had been a deacon for 11 years, and where he had farmed for 25, and where men asked his opinion about weather and cattle, and say the words, "I cannot read." He would rather have lost the farm. And in the end, that is exactly what happened. And I have made my peace with it. But it took me years, and I am not going to pretend to you that I made it easily. There were nights in the spring of 34 when I was so angry at that man. I could not stay in the house. He knew for 20 months. He had a wife who could read anything put in front of her, sleeping 4 feet from him every night for 20 months. And he took it to the north field with him instead. He did not do it because he did not trust me. He did it because he could not bear for me to know that his brother had made a fool of him for 3 years, while I stood at the stove with my back to the table. Men have died of that. Mine did. The last 8 days went like this. I made a list, everything I had, and everything I needed, and who had it. Wendell Frick worked for $4 and then for nothing. And I want his name said properly at least once. Wendell Alois Frick of Kearney, Nebraska, who was 29 years old and had a wife and a baby and 11 clients, and who spent 9 days of his life on a widow who could not pay him because he could not stand what he had found. We could not stop the sale. He filed a petition on the 24th of February, and the judge would not hear it before the first Monday of March, because there was nothing in front of him but a widow's oath against a bank president's signature. So the sale was going to happen. We accepted that on the 26th, and after that, everything got simpler. The way things do when you stop trying to hold off the thing that is coming, and start deciding what will be standing there when it arrives. Frick sent one letter to Omaha, to the office of the comptroller of the currency, and one to the state banking department at Lincoln, and both of them said the same thing in careful language. That a national bank examiner arriving at the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Ashgrove in the month of March, 1934, might wish to compare the signature on a note dated the 9th of April, 1931, with the signature on the marriage license of the same party, and might further wish to inquire how a man who executed his father's estate papers with an X came to execute 3 instruments in 11 months. Ransom Teague closed his store for a day and drove to Kearney himself with his 1932 ledger on the seat beside him and let Frick copy the pages. Opal Renfrew made her statement in front of a notary in Ashgrove and then went home and told 4 women at the church about it, which I had not asked her to do and which turned out to be worth more than the notary. And on the 2nd of March, 3 days before the sale, I did the last thing. I went out to the sod cellar and got the tin box, and I took it into the kitchen and put every paper back into it in order, and on the top I put the release that Hollis had carried to Ransom Teague in June of 1931, so that his brother would not find it in this house. Then I sat down and did something I had been putting off for a month. I got out the school slate, and I called Amos in from the barn, and I sat my son down at the kitchen table. "You're 14, I said. "In 4 years, you'll be signing your own name to things." "I can sign my name, Ma." "I know it." I put the note in front of him, the certified copy with the 2 signatures at the bottom. "Read that to me." And he did. He read the whole of it, out loud, slowly, the printing and the hand-filled parts both, because Hollis Ackerly had walked 4 miles into Ash Grove in the fall of 1925 to tell a school teacher that his boy would be attending every single day the weather allowed, and that if the boy was ever kept home for work, she was to send word to him personally. When Amos got to the bottom, he stopped. "That's Pa's name," he said. "That's not yours." "No," I said. "It isn't." He sat there, and I watched him put it together, and it took him about as long as it takes to read this sentence, because he was Hollis's son, and he was not slow about anything except talking. "Uncle Orrin," he said. "Yes." Amos Ackerly, 14 years old, put both hands flat on the kitchen table exactly the way his father used to, and said a word I will not repeat, and I did not correct him.
"On Monday," I said, "there is going to be a sale on the courthouse steps, and we are going to go, all 3 of us, in our good clothes, and we are going to stand at the front where everybody can see us." "What good is that?" "None at all," I said. "Standing there is not what wins it, but I want you to see it, and I want him to have to look at you while he does it." The night before, I could not sleep, and I did not try very hard. I sat up in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and the box on the table in front of me, and I went through the whole of it one more time, every paper, the way Hollis had gone through it on the night in June of '29 when he came home with the release in his shirt pocket. Around 2 in the morning, Bertie came out barefoot and climbed into my lap, 11 years old and too big for it, and put her head under my chin. "Is a man coming to take the house?" "A man is going to try." She thought about that. "Are you scared?" And I sat there in my own kitchen with my daughter's hair against my throat, and the lamp making the same circle of light on the same table it had made for 40 years. And I found that I was telling her the truth. "No," I said. "Not anymore." The first Monday of March, 1934, came up clear and cold with a wind out of the northwest that took the skin off your face. There were maybe 70 people on the courthouse square by 9:30, which was more than any sale had drawn in that town in 2 years. Opal had seen to that. So had the Sentinel, and so had 4 women at the Ash Grove Methodist Church, and so had the plain fact that in a county where every soul was 1 bad year from the same steps, people will come and watch it happen to somebody else and stand very close together while they do. We came in at 20 of 10. I had Bertie by the hand and Amos on my left in his father's good coat with the sleeves turned up inside. And I had on my church hat, and I was carrying the tin box. I want to say a word about the box, because people asked me afterward why I brought it, as if it were a trick. It was not a trick. Wendell Frick did not know I was bringing it. I brought it because it was mine, and because everything in it was true, and because I had spent 5 weeks being told what my own life said, and I was not going to stand on those steps empty-handed. Orrin was already there, at the front, in his hat and his good coat, with his hands behind his back. Clay Dunmore stood off to the side with 2 men from the bank. The sheriff's deputy who was to cry the sale had the notice in his hand and was stamping his feet against the cold. And there was a 4th man I did not know, standing apart at the bottom of the steps, in a gray overcoat and city shoes, with a leather case, watching the crowd the way a man watches a field he is thinking of buying. Wendell Frick came up beside me and said quietly, "Do not speak to anybody. Do not answer Orrin. Whatever happens, do not speak until I tell you." "Who is that man?" "That," said Frick, "is Mr. Harlan Voss of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and he has been in the vault at the Farmers and Merchants Bank since 8 o'clock Thursday morning, and I do not know one thing more than that, and neither do you." At 10 o'clock, the deputy read the notice out. It is a short document, and it takes about 90 seconds, and I heard every word of it. The description of the property is the longest part.
The southeast quarter of Section 9, Township 8 North, Range 21 west of the 6th Principal Meridian, Pardee County, Nebraska, containing 160 acres, more or less. That is my farm in the language the law uses, and it does not sound like anything at all. "Bids," said the deputy. $1,840, said Verna Ackerly. Nobody else said a word. That is the part of it that I hear at night sometimes, even now. 70 people, and the wind, and nobody said a word. $1,840, the deputy said. "Do I hear more?" And Wendell Frick said, in a voice that carried, "Mr. Deputy, before you cry that sale I am directed to make an offer of proof on the record, and there is a gentleman here from the Comptroller of the Currency who I believe would like it made." What happened next took about 11 minutes. I do not have every word. Frick had the copies and read them out. The estate of Absalom Ackerly, 1911, with the X in the clerk's certificate that the instrument had been read aloud to the said Hollis Ackerly. My marriage license with my signature on it. The note of the 9th of April, 1931, with the same name and the M in it. Opal Renfrew's notarized statement, and Opal standing at the front with her chin up while it was read. The grantor index entries. Teague's ledger page for the 22nd of June, 1932. And when he was done, Frick turned and said, "Mr. Dunmore, you told this widow in your office on the 2nd of February that only you and her husband were present on the 9th of April, 1931. Clay Dunmore said, "I said as I recall." 3 weeks after that date, you signed as witness to an assignment, giving half of that farm to the man standing beside you. That is a separate matter. "Mr. Voss," said Frick, "does the bank's copy of the April note bear a witness line?" And the man in the gray overcoat opened his leather case and looked at a paper in it for a moment, and said, in a flat voice like a man reading a train schedule, "It bears a witness line. It is signed O. Ackerly." The sound the crowd made was not loud. It was a kind of long breath all at once, 70 people. Because everybody on that square knew what it meant. A man had witnessed his own brother's signature on a note, and then 3 weeks later, taken half the land for himself, and then stood on the courthouse steps and bid the exact amount of the debt on a dead man's farm, in a coat he had worn to that man's funeral 6 weeks before. Verna Ackerly turned around and looked at me for the first time that morning. And I want to tell you what I saw, because I have had 22 years to think about it, and I have never once been able to make it simple. He did not look like a man caught out. He looked like a man who had been carrying a weight up a hill for 3 years, and had just had it taken off him, and did not know yet whether he was relieved or ruined. He said, loud enough for the front rows, "He signed them, every one. Ask her. He signed every one of them with his own hand, and I never once put a pen in it." "He could not read them," I said. I had been told not to speak. I spoke. "He could not read one word of them, Orrin, and you know it.
because you were the one that read them to him. And you had been reading them to him since he was 7 years old, and they kept him home to work and sent you to school." "He was a grown man!" Oren shouted it. That is the only time I ever heard him raise his voice in his life. "He was a grown man, and he could have learned it any time he wanted. I offered him. 20 years I offered him. Go and learn your letters, Holly." And he would not, because he could not stand for anybody to see him not know a thing. And you never made him either. He was pointing at me. His hand was shaking. "You covered for him worse than I did. 20 years you read his mail out loud like it was gossip, so he wouldn't have to ask. Don't you stand there on them steps and tell me I made him a fool. He was a fool about paper, and the both of us kept him that way because it was easier." Nobody moved. And that is the true thing about that morning. And it is the reason I have never been able to enjoy the memory of it the way people think I ought to. He was not entirely wrong. That is what nobody tells you about the day you win. There was a piece of the truth in his mouth, and he was using it as a weapon, but it was still the truth, and it went in. Then Harlan Voss of the comptroller's office said quietly, "Mr. Dunmore, I will want the note ledger for 1931 and 32, and I will want it this morning." And Clay Dunmore, 60 years old, president of that bank for 26 years, said, "Yes." Just that. Yes. He did not argue, and he did not bluster, and I watched him become an old man between one breath and the next, and he sat down on the low wall by the steps and put his hands on his knees and looked at the ground, and he did not get up again until they helped him. The deputy did not cry the sale. He said he was going to want instruction from the county attorney, and the crowd stood there another half hour, not wanting to leave. And Opal Renfrew took Birdie's other hand, and Amos stood beside me with his jaw set exactly like his father's. And after a while, people began to come up to me one at a time and say things, and I could not tell you now what any of them said. The sale was set aside by the district court at Kearney on the 19th of April. The note of the 9th of April, 1931, was found void as to me, because my signature on it was forged, and voidable as to the estate. The assignment of the half-interest was set aside for fraud. The Farmers and Merchants Bank of Ashgrove was closed by the comptroller on the 26th of March, 1934, and its affairs were wound up over the next 2 years, and the depositors were paid 61 cents on the dollar, which is better than a good many banks in that state managed, and which does not help you if you are one of the depositors. Clay Dunmore was indicted on 11 counts. He pled to 4 of them in the fall of '34, misapplication of funds and the making of false entries, and he was sentenced to 5 years at Leavenworth and served 3. He died in Grand Island in 1941, at the home of a daughter. I did not go. Verna Ackerly was indicted for forgery in the 2nd degree and for uttering a forged instrument. He was tried in the district court at Kearney in October of 1934, and I sat in that courtroom for 4 days and gave my evidence on the 2nd day. And I looked at him while I did it, because I had promised myself I would. He was convicted on both counts, and sentenced to not less than 3, nor more than 5 years at the state penitentiary at Lincoln. He served 2 years and 4 months. And the 80 acres on the North Line, his half of their father's ground, the poor half, the half he had spent his whole life measuring against ours, went to the bank's receiver to pay the costs of his defense, and was sold in 1936 to a man from Holdridge for $9 an acre. He tried to take a farm by forging a name, and he lost his own by signing his. I did not plan that. I want to say so plainly.
There are people who have told this story back to me over the years as though I arranged it, and I did not arrange anything.
I only refused to lie down for 18 days. And the rest of it was just what happens when you turn a light on in a room where things have been going on in the dark. We kept the place. That is the part I have to say out loud sometimes, even now, in the kitchen, when the wind gets up. We kept the place. 160 acres, the southeast quarter of Section 9, Township 8 North, Range 21 West of the 6th Principal Meridian, Pardee County, Nebraska, containing 160 acres, more or less, and a house built in 1891 by a man I never met, and a nail by the kitchen door. It did not end the way the courthouse steps make it sound. Nothing ends the way a verdict sounds. We were $430 in debt to Ransom Teague, and we had no team worth the name, because the good mare had gone lame in February, and I had not been able to think about it. 1934 was the worst crop year in the history of the state of Nebraska. In May, the dust came out of the west and blew for 3 days and buried the fence line on the south side up to the second wire, and there was no wheat that fall to speak of, not on my place or anybody's. We ate what came out of the garden and what Opal brought over and what the church sent, and I took in washing from 4 families in Ash Grove, and Amos worked for wages at the Renfrew place and gave me every dollar of it, and I took it, which was a harder thing than any of it. We did not get out from under until 1938. I paid Ransom Teague back in installments over 4 years, the last one in September of 38, $11.60. And when I put it in his hand, he looked at it and said, "Well." And I said, "Well." And that was the entire conversation. And neither one of us could have stood any more of it than that. He died in 1943. There were 9 people at the funeral. I have thought many times about the fact that the town of Ash Grove let that man carry the name of the elevator failure for 21 years, and that the only reason anybody ever knew different was that a widow needed a store ledger in the winter of 34. I told it at every opportunity for the rest of his life, and I am telling it now. Ransom Teague paid other men's debts twice, and both times in silence, and I would not have my farm without him. Opal Renfrew lived to be 88. She is buried at Ash Grove, 4 rows over from Hollis. She was at my table every Sunday for 26 years, and she never once said "I told you so" about anything, which, given how often she could have, is its own kind of monument. Wendell Frick was elected county attorney of Buffalo County in 1940 and served 2 terms and became a district judge in 1951. He would never take money from me. In 1946, when Amos got married, Judge Frick drove 90 miles to sit in a folding chair in my yard and eat chicken off a paper plate. And he told my son that the finest piece of lawyering he ever did was worth $4. And he never got the $4. Bertie married a man from Holdridge in 1942 and has 3 children and can still hear nothing at all out of her left ear and has never once let it slow her down. And Amos farmed that ground for 31 years. He was married in the front room. He put in the electricity in 1949, and I stood in the kitchen and watched the bulb come on over the table. And I did not like it, and never did. He bought the North 80 back in 1954 from the man in Holdridge for $62 an acre, and he did it without saying one word to me about what it was. And when the paper came, he brought it in and laid it on the kitchen table and put his finger on the date and went out and stood in the yard with his back to the house for a long while. I did not say anything about that either. Some things run in a family whether you want them to or not. Now, 2 more things, and then I will let you go. The first is about Orrin. He came out of Lincoln in the spring of 1937, and he did not come back to Pardee County. He went to Idaho and worked in a lumber yard in a town called Sandpoint. And he never married, and he died in 1958 of a stroke at 66. In the fall of 1956, he wrote me a letter, 2 pages, in that fine, clear hand he had, the same hand that had written my name with an M in it. It was not an apology. I want to be honest about that, because people always want it to have been an apology. It was an account. He set out what he had done, in order, dates and amounts, more accurately than the court had managed, and at the end of it he wrote, "I have thought about it every day for 22 years, and I have never been able to get it to come out any way but this. I did not do it to him because I hated him. I done it because he was the one they kept home, and the whole county thought the sun rose out of Verna Ackerly. And I was the one they sent to school, and I could read every word in that courthouse, and I still could not grow wheat on that North 80. I wanted one thing that was mine, on account of what I knew. That is the whole of it, and it is a small, dirty reason, and I have had to live inside it." I did not answer that letter for 4 months. Then I wrote him back 1 line, and I want to tell you what it was, because I am not proud of all of it, and I am done being anything but truthful with you. I wrote, "You could have read to him without lying to him, and you would have had a brother." He wrote back in March, 1 line too, I know it. That is the last I ever heard from him. He died in November. The second thing is about the lamp, and then I am finished. For a long time after all of it, I could not sit at that table in the evening. I would do the dishes and go to bed at 7 o'clock like an old woman. The lamp had been on that table when I opened the box in February and found my name written by another hand, and I did not want it lit. And then, one night, in the winter of '35, Amos, who was 15 and in his last year of school, and who had said perhaps 900 words since his father died, came in and set his books on the table and lit the lamp himself without asking, and sat down and started in on his figures. And I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at my son doing his schoolwork by the same lamp his grandfather had read the seed catalogs by. And something in me came unlocked. I sat down across from him, and after a while I got the tin box down and put it on the table between us, and opened it, and I said, "You are going to know what every one of these is." And we went through them, one at a time. The deed, and the title, and the abstract, and the release, and the certified copy of the note with the false name at the bottom. And I told him what each one meant, and what it could do, and what it could be made to do. And it took 4 nights. And on the last night, I put in a fresh page, and wrote at the top of it, in my own hand, without any middle initial, a list of every paper in that box, and where it had come from, and what it proved. That list is still in there. It has been added to 7 times. Hollis used to say the box held everything that mattered. And for 19 years, I thought that was a sweet thing to say about a family. It was not sweet. It was the exact and literal truth, and neither of us understood it. Everything that mattered was in that box, and he could not read a line of it, and it nearly took the ground out from under his children. The box is on the shelf over the stove now, where the lamp used to sit. I am 61 years old. I have a great-granddaughter who will start school in Ash Grove in the fall. And last month, she sat in his kitchen and read me the label off a can of peaches, slowly, the whole thing,
including the part about the net weight, and I sat and listened to every word of it as if it were scripture. Because that is what it cost. That is what it actually cost in this family, to be able to read a can of peaches out loud in a kitchen. The lamp still works.
I light it sometimes when the power goes out in a storm, and the light it throws is the same light it threw on the night my husband came home with the release in his shirt pocket, and on the night I found out what he had been carrying alone for 20 months, and on the night my son sat down and did his figures and let me back into the room. It is a small light. It does not reach the corners, but it is enough to read by, and I have learned that this is the only thing you can ever really ask of a light. Well, friends, that is where the story leaves us, and I have a question for you before you go. Hollis Ackerly had 20 months to tell his wife the truth, and he chose to carry it alone, because he could not bear for her to see him as a man who had been made a fool of. Do you believe he was protecting her, or do you believe he was protecting himself, and called it protection because that was easier to live with? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every one of them.
Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. There should be a playlist coming up on your screen with other stories from this channel, and I would love for you to stay a while longer. The lamp is lit.